My name is Stan or Stanley Tusman. We've been at Anderson for 3 years now, and then we came to Hope. Probably it's within a month or so. I was born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I was raised in an Orthodox household, and my father, who actually worked for 2 jobs for 31 years, so I rarely saw him except for on the Sabbath, because he did not work from Friday night to Saturday night, and Thursday afternoon when he slept on the sofa in his underwear. I was started early, 7, 8 years old, going to shul on a couple days a week, on Sunday and on Wednesday. I began studying the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which is what every Orthodox Jew goes through. For me, it was when I was by myself, sitting next to a creek, and that's a Philadelphia word for creek, and sitting next to a huge oak tree and finding a little acorn. And at that point in time, when I said, this became that, that's God. And nothing can convince me otherwise. The reason I'm by the creek by myself is that I grew up in a diverse but Catholic area, and there was a great deal of anti-Semitism. Basically, I was labeled as a Christ killer. That's the way they were taught. So it was a constant battle. And although I was tall, skinny, and somewhat of a nerd, I became extremely aggressive to survive. The kids in the neighborhood were pretty abusive. They would never, accept or embrace. So my limitation was, just a few people who lived on my block. When I was 13, it was after my bar mitzvah, so I became a man in Jewish tradition. It was Yom Kippur, the Holy Day of Atonement, and I went to shul, the temple, to pray, because that's what you do. You are rather isolated, and all you're supposed to do is think about God. And I was devoted to doing that. So I went to temple, and I went to sit down in the temple, and the cantor, which is a rabbi and a cantor, is in charge of the congregation, basically. The cantor asked me not to sit in the seat that I chose. I asked him why. He explained to me that people made a contribution and they had their customary seats, and they would be uncomfortable coming in having to ask me to move because that's their seat. So I asked the cantor, you mean I have to buy a seat in the house of God? My father, was a cab driver. He did not make a lot of money. He did not make a contribution that year. And so we did not buy the seat. So at that point in time, I had to take off my tallis, the prayer shawl, the tefillin, the little prayer boxes that we have on our forehead and our arm, took off my yarmulke, and you don't do that in shul. I took it off, I laid it on the pew, I got up and I walked out. Have not walked back into a Orthodox synagogue since. After that event, because again, an Orthodox Jew in an Orthodox household, there was some friction, especially with my dad. And my dad said, if you don't like the rules, don't let the door hit you in the backside on the way out. So I moved out at age 15, moved down to the corner, and I still came home every weekend. I still did our prayers together with my father, but I was not considered part of the household. And I stayed there until I was about 18 years old. I got a draft notice. My dad, who was actually a military hero, we did not know about that until he passed away, that he had 2 Bronze Stars. But he called me up, had me paged out of school, and said, go to Canada, I'll send money. He did not want me to fight in that war. because of being independent and appreciating what America has done for me and the opportunities I've had, I went down and I enlisted the next morning. I enlisted so that I could get into finance, which is the study that I was taking in college. They let me take finance, but then they gave me a secondary MOS, military occupational service designation, as a special operations because of something they saw in my attitude or what I was, or something that they saw in me that I didn't want, but they gave it to me anyway. After basic training and ops training, they sent me to Vietnam. And when I was there, I saw a lot of terrible things. And that really shattered my belief that there is a living God. I knew there's a God, but how could he let that happen? But I never lost faith in God. I just really struggled with, where is he now? Got out of the service and came back to the United States after five and a half years over there. And it was actually almost as bad coming back into the United States, where they hated us GIs from Vietnam. A lot of protests, a lot of really difficult situations. Well, when I was overseas, I married a Buddhist woman. With her, I had 2 children, one overseas, and when we got back to stateside, had another child. I could speak the Siamese. That's why I took that as my foreign language, so we were able to communicate. She had a difficult time adjusting somewhat to this, and she became somewhat depressed. She had a tubular pregnancy which had ruptured and almost took her life. And they said she could never get pregnant again, but 9 months later she was pregnant with my second child. And she just couldn't handle that. She just basically took a walk and they found her in the street, basically comatose. They rushed her to the hospital. They had her on complete life support. She was completely brain dead. There was no hope. But it was a Jesuit hospital, and they could not take her off of life support. It's against the faith. So they asked me to do that. So I called my dad. He came by, and I pulled the plug. So now I have 2 children, and I have a full-time job, and working in the corporate world, working my way up. So basically, you work 50, 60 hours, and you're trying to keep 2 kids. I met another young woman, and we ended up getting married. That was a marriage of convenience and not a sanctioned marriage by the Lord. So as my son grew up, my younger one grew up, and before his 6th birthday, he came down with leukemia, and we had another child in the meantime with her, and she could not handle my older son, who really never accepted her as a mother. My younger son, my middle son, who has very ill, and the demands are incredibly intense. She couldn't handle that, so we ended up separating, and I moved to Chicago. And in Chicago, I went to Loyola where he was being treated. I asked him, is there something that I could do to be able to keep him out of the hospital a little bit more? And they said, because they have met me, they've been dealing with me now for a while, they said, well, if you're interested, I will give you a crash course as a nurse. You can become a registered nurse so that you can administer the chemotherapy. And I said, great, let's do it. So I became a nurse, and I treated my son and 2 other young kids from the neighborhood who had also had leukemia. Because I was a nurse, I was able to accompany my son to field trips with the school. Otherwise, he could not go on field trips. And I met some of the teachers. And one of the teachers kind of took a liking to me. She invited me over to her house for a Trivial Pursuit party. And during that party, there was this young woman who came over, who was finished the game, came over, and we sat at the refrigerator, and she started talking about God. And I'm always acceptable to talking about God. I had a strong belief in God. I just did not have any personal relationship with a living God, especially with my experiences from overseas and all the other mishigas that I've gone through. And I found out after we talked a little bit, and she wanted to get to me, to get to my son, because she knew he had leukemia and it did not look good. He's already relapsed once, and it was doubtful how long he would live, and she wanted to witness to him. She was a really good young Christian woman and pretty good looking. So we sat there and we talked for a couple hours, and she was not shoving Jesus down my throat, which has been my previous experience, which I did mention, but back in Philadelphia and in New York City where I was working, the Jews for Jesus came up to me and tried to beat me up with a Bible, which didn't go over really well. So I had really, after all the anti-Semitism, Christ killer, and that experience, I really wasn't interested in Jesus Christ. I mean, come on, leave me alone. I know there's a Messiah. I studied the Torah. I've read the rest of the Old Testament. I had a good working knowledge of the Bible. I knew that my Messiah is somewhere. He's going to come back, and he's going to be my conquering king. But I don't know where he was at the time. We started talking, and one thing led to another, and I am not spontaneous at all. Everything I do is planned and worked out in an nth degree, but 6 weeks later we were married. That truly is a God thing. God sent her to me at that time for me, to bring me to him. But she wasn't going to be able to do that herself. But she was going to church. I went to church with her. But because she married a non-believer, the elder-run church asked her to stop going to the classes that she was attending because she could not do that and be married to a non-believer. The pastor, who was a marvelous individual, apologized. He said, "I'm sorry, it's elder-led church. Nothing I can do about this, but let me introduce you to this guy, Lenny Kahn, who was a Messianic Jew." So we got together, and because he was a Jew, I could talk to him, and well, Jews don't talk, we argue. And for the next 6 months, basically, we sat at my dining room table. I actually broke the dining room table, pounding on it in one of the arguments. And he was showing me Yeshua HaMashiach, which is Jesus Christ the Messiah, but from a very Jewish perspective. All the prophecies, all of the things, and one of my burning questions ever since I was a child was, how could God abandon his people, his chosen people, for 2,000 years? The temple was destroyed. We cannot make a sacrifice. The only way to redeem our sins is through a blood sacrifice. We can't sacrifice, so we're going through the motions of Yom Kippur and praying and fasting and doing all that, but it wasn't real. It was like I'm acting it out, but my sins are still there because I can't make a sacrifice. Lanny went through all the biblical things and showed me my conquering king, my Messiah, really did conquer. Jesus Christ is the conquering king. He conquered sin. Because you cannot conquer the Roman Empire until you conquer the sin. So that was his sacrifice, the blood sacrifice, that I no longer had to make a sacrifice at the temple. I didn't need a temple. I now had the temple in me as Jesus became a resident and his whole spirit in me. So that's where I came to faith in Jesus with Christ in my life. And I've been obsessive compulsive. I've taken charge. I've been in control. And I've forced myself on everything in every way. My expression was, I will win if I have to go through you, around you, or over you. And when I matured in my belief with Jesus Christ and with the benefit of having a beautiful Christian woman at my side, I realized that I'm no longer even desired to have control. He's in control of my life, and I am so much happier. I no longer have to compete for anything. And the more I do, the more he gives, so I'm better off anyway. I refer to myself as a fulfilled Jew. I am a Jew. I am a completed Jew. I found my Messiah. And since right now in Bible study, we're studying the last book of the Bible, Revelations, and it's, he's going to come back now as the conquering king of the empires. And I'm ready. Whenever he's ready, I'm ready. We're called to be a disciple. And when Pastor asked me to do this, I didn't answer him right away. I had to go back and my wife and we had to pray about what this is all about. And if somehow this helps somebody else understand a little bit about my Messiah, our God, then there's a benefit to that. And that's why I'm doing it, is just to benefit him. It has nothing to do with me. Again, I didn't want to do this. I was a little uncomfortable doing this. I've given out too much personal information, which is not my tendency. But if anybody can hear this and say, there is hope, there's hope. And Jesus said, love is the most important commandment. And this is an act of love for those who are struggling.